Hey everyone, it's Dr. Kula here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this week's material because a lot of people get confused when it comes to the quantitative designs, even more than they do when it comes to the qualitative designs. And so I'm going to break down a couple of the differences that you're going to see. Really what a lot of people think of when they think of qualitative work is experimental designs. And this is when you have two groups, one that has some kind of treatment or undergoes some kind of activity, and then you have a control group who does not go through that treatment or activity, and then you see at the end of the treatment or activity if there's a difference on some kind of outcome. So this happens not a lot actually in education, and the reason is because a lot of times people find it unethical to randomly assign students, pull them out of their existing classrooms and randomly assign them to groups and give them different treatment based on some kind of random assignment. Specifically, taking them out of their existing classrooms is what a lot of people object to, because the biggest thing about a true experimental design is that it has to have random assignment. In other words, if you're a complete pool of participants, every single person has to have an equal chance of being in the control group or in the experimental group. And so you cannot use, say, existing classrooms or anything like that. You have to pull kids randomly in education to do experimental research. And that just schools aren't designed that way, and so true experimental research really doesn't happen a lot. But when you're looking in terms of the matching exercise that's going to happen, you have to see the word random assignment in order to say that something is experimental. If you don't see the word random assignment, it is not experimental research. If existing classrooms or some existing group is used as a experimental group, and then another one is used as a control group, that is quasi-experimental because there isn't a random assignment to the different groups. You're using something that already exists. And the reason it's quasi-experimental, I mean, I've heard people say, well, aren't students randomly assigned to classrooms and therefore the classrooms they represent a random assignment? And the answer is actually no. Even if students are randomly assigned initially to classes, the fact that these students have an ongoing teacher that's different from the other one allows for between classroom differences. In other words, at the end of the experiment, someone could come in and say, hey, there's an alternative explanation. This group maybe did better than this group, not because of the intervention, but because they have a better teacher. And you can't prove that that's not at least a factor in the outcome. And so because you have an existing difference in the groups that you use in educational research, when you use existing classrooms, that's not truly experimental. It's quasi-experimental research. Still, you're doing some kind of experiment. You're putting one class through a program or through some kind of treatment, some kind of activity, and seeing how their outcomes differ from another group's outcomes who don't do that particular program. So that's quasi-experimental. The softest type of what you'd call almost experimental, or at least something that kind of looks like experimental research, is causal comparative research. Here you're actually not putting a particular group through a program and then seeing the outcomes. You're actually comparing two existing groups on existing criteria. So this is done retrospectively, basically. You're looking at, for example, how EL students, English language learner students, versus non-ELs differ on GPA or on their outcomes on a test or on some other criteria. And so these are existing pieces of data. You could say, hey, the ELs had the English language learner program. You know, they have pull-out programs, or they have, SEDAI lessons that are given specifically to them, or something like that. And while that's true, there's so much going on in the educational progress of these two groups. You didn't pull one out and actually do something from the beginning different with them. You're just looking at existing data and seeing if there's a difference in the average performance of this group versus that group. So that's a causal comparative. You can't really say that the fact that this group was EL in my example, you can't really say that that was the determining factor or that caused the difference in these groups. You can only say that there was a significant, statistically significant or not, difference between these two groups on that one outcome. And you can't really say specifically why that occurred, because there may be multiple factors in play there. So that's causal comparative. If you do not have a specific treatment that these two groups go through, or that one group goes through with a control, then you do not have either experimental or quasi-experimental. What you have is causal comparative. So there's not really a control. It's just a difference. You're comparing two different groups on one item. Okay, then you have what's called correlational research. And you hear people say the word correlate all the time, or relate. So warm weather is related to an increase in crime, for example. We know that those are related. As one goes up, the other also goes up. And so these are not comparing two groups. You're not comparing cold days versus hot days on the crime rate. You're actually saying, as you're looking at a scale, one scale, cold all the way to hot, with all of those pieces in between, and crime rates, which also are low crime rate up to high. You can actually numerically say that as this goes up 1 degree, the crime rate tends to go up by so many, I don't know, crimes per capita or whatever. So you can actually, these are both sliding scales that go up together, or they can actually go the opposite way. For example, higher anxiety is correlated to lower performance, and the higher the anxiety level, the lower we can show the performance gets, and it's a sliding scale. So if you're not saying this is if you're not comparing groups, but you're actually comparing variables and actually relating them to each other on a sliding scale, that is correlational research. The last type of quantitative research that you'll see in this week's lesson is descriptive. And descriptive is basically just looking at trends. It's saying what percentage of people are feeling this way versus that way versus the other way. What percentage of, let's say, college graduates, what percentage of college graduates are from different ethnicities? And you can track the trends in that over time. So, for example, we know that more and more Latino students are enrolling in college, but we know that we're not seeing an increase at the same rate of actual graduation from college. So there's actually a place, because we can see those trends, we can see that, wow, this is a group that's really getting stuck in the college realm. And so we know then that we need to really bolster supports for that population in college, because we can see those trends. So it's descriptive research is a lot based on percentages. It's based on means, averages that are kind of tracked a long time, but you're not really comparing a group to another group necessarily. You're not saying, so you're not comparing, let's say, two variables and saying as one goes up, the other goes down, or as one goes up, the other goes up. It's just a pure description, usually based on percentages, especially of kind of what's occurring out there. There's not really an experiment of any type going on at all. So I hope that kind of helps unpack a little bit the differences between the quantitative designs that you'll see. If you have any questions, as always, just feel free to reach out. I try to get back to people very, very quickly, and just want to make sure that I give you the support you need to really understand some of the distinctions between these major quantitative types of designs. Okay? See you later. Bye.